Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming down to the library this afternoon. We're really happy to have Emily Shinn here from the University of Oregon George Stinson Museum, and she is going to offer a presentation that's tied to the Ralph Steadman retrospective, which is happening over at the museum right now, and it runs through January 19th. There's some information in back. So if you're interested, it's a great retrospective, so I'd encourage you to head on over there and take a look if you have time. I also wanted to thank the Friends of the Indiana Public Library, the Library Foundation, because they provide the support we need to offer such wonderful programs and bring people like Emily over to the library. Thanks for coming, Emily.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so my name's Emily Shinn, and I am a curatorial extern at the George Stinson Museum of Art. And thank you for spending a portion of your Saturday with us and supporting this wonderful series of events between the museum and the Eugene Public Library in conjunction with the Ralph Steadman retrospective. As Scott said, it's open through January 19th, so I hope everyone will make time to see it once or see it again. This talk is also in conjunction with an exhibition at the museum that recently opened and will be on view through August 2020, titled The Satirical Eye. The exhibition explores satirical print culture in 18th and 19th century Western Europe through the etchings, engravings, and lithographs of British artists William Hogarth and James Gillray, Spanish artist Francisco de Goya, and French artist Honoré Daumier. This talk will provide a brief history of the genres of visual satire and caricature, of which these four artists represent the apogee in their respective mediums and cultures. Working in response to their social and political circumstances, their work is a compendium of unapologetic, subjective historical documents that stride the chasm between journalistic objectivity and personal polemic, which can be seen as the foundations of what would become Ralph Steadman's pictorial ventures in gonzo journalism. So we will start with a couple of definitions. Satire is a multimedia genre that uses humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize prevailing immorality or foolishness, especially as a form of social or political commentary. Caricature is most often identified as grotesque or ludicrous representation of persons or things by the exaggeration of their most characteristic or striking features. These two modes of expression permeate contemporary culture, from political cartoons and print journalism to television shows and news programs. They are embraced as influential tools of comedic relief, cultural commentary, political protest, and liberated creativity. In visual art, the two mediums often appear together in symbiotic partnership. Satire provides thematic context, which is enhanced by the additional stylistic element of caricature. The roots of visual satire can be traced back to the anonymous commentary of Egyptian papyri and Greek and Roman vases ridiculing the pretensions of gods and mortals. The history of satirical prints, however, is acknowledged to begin in the 15th century in Northern Europe and in Germany in particular, where innovations in papermaking, printmaking, and engraving enabled images to be distributed to significantly wider audiences and for artists to work independently from the church. Satirical jabs at religious hypocrisy proliferated, laying the foundation for the moral critique exemplified by Hogarth and Goya in the coming centuries, which we'll see in future slides. Hiram Misbash is one of the first artists to create a symbolic language for this new visual medium, followed in the 17th century by more documentary commentary. On the left, in this print, we see an engraving after a lost print by Bosch that depicts a group of monks and clergy participating in sinful behavior. The print foreshadows the close relationship between satire and caricature, using grotesque facial distortions to emphasize defects of internal character. The second print documents the real-life scandal of chaplain named Henry Sacheverell, who gave a sermon at St. Paul's in London in 1709, which attacked both secular and ecclesiastic governments as traitors, encouraging the so-called corrupt practices of foreign immigrants. The sermon sparked a season of controversy and riots, during which the Sacheverell was impeached, brought to trial, and embraced as a victim by his cult followers. Civic unrest continued between his supporters and his detractors, and the controversy spawned a proliferation of texts, pamphlets, and broadsheets that denounced and satirized the entire event. This broadsheet charges the impeached cleric with corrupt popery, showing him in the act of writing the infamous sermon supported by his, quote, 2 seconds, noted in the title, which are the devil and the pope. As we can see in these prints, satire evolved as a keenly moralistic veil of humor to relay serious messages that intertwine symbolic, even fantastic allusions with contemporary reference points. Both social and political satire grew highly attuned to exposing the weaknesses and hypocrisies of power, class systems, customs, and religion, simultaneously using generalized archetypes and portraiture to respond to daily events while also ridiculing everyday irritations and common human failings to which everyone can relate. Caricature developed along similar trajectory, integrated into the satirical discourse as a tool to increase the expressive wit and criticism of these visual narratives. Though experimentations in caricature appear in the early satirical prints, as we saw in the previous slide, the term was not coined until the 16th century in Italy, used as a descriptive for facial studies conducted by brothers Annibale and Agostino Carracci. The word likely derives from the Italian carico, meaning to load, and caricare, meaning to exaggerate. Artists such as the Carraccis, Leonardo da Vinci, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and Pier Leon Ghezzi, who was the first professional caricaturist, began to investigate the notion that portraiture is merely a system of visual signs that can be distorted without confusing or masking the identity of the subject. In these early explorations, caricature was often only a descriptive term applied to specifically exaggerated portraiture, termed a portrait charge, in which real recognizable people were distorted just outside of their idealized or normal features. As further categories developed, allegorical caricature became prominent in the genre, often attuned to politics or representing people as animals. This was followed closely by social caricature, which depicts symbolic archetypes rather than real people. The grotesque was an early tool of caricature. Today, the term is used often to reference particularly ugly or strange distortions from an expected norm, which communicate internal defects, ugliness of character, or moral failure. It derives from 15th century descriptions of the integrated proliferation of animals, plants, decorative forms, and masks that are found in Roman frescoes. The style was particularly embraced in Northern Europe, where the link between physical ugliness and evil remained strong under the influence of religious doctrine. In expanding the link, and the grotesque often expands the classical tradition of ideal exterior proportions as a symbol for interior goodness. So artists asked what unidealized and even discomfiting proportions might communicate instead. Related to the grotesque, studies in physiognomy, which comes from the Greek word physis, meaning nature, and nomon, meaning judge or interpreter, were heavily related to caricature. And the practice of physiognomy was a practice of assessing a person's character or personality from their outer appearance, especially facial features. So these ideas were quickly associated within the genre of visual caricature and integrated into artist manuals, as you can see here, in which deviations from the expected norm or quote idealized norm were matched with their apparently associated personality traits. So traits like arrogance, imbecility, superficiality could be represented and recognized in the shape of a brow, the size of a mouth or a nose, or a set of eyes. As we go further in the slides, I'm going to focus on Hogarth, Gillray, Goya, and Daumier to explore how they integrated these historical precedents toward their own ends, expanding the genres of satire and caricature, and creating a foundational template for contemporary artists, illustrators, and cartoonists like Stedman. The history of modern graphic satire often begins with William Hogarth, who is considered the father of the satirical print and the beacon of Britain's golden age of satire, which traces his prime years of activity from the 1720s to the 1760s. As a master of the printed series, Hogarth spun engaging narratives of moral critique, lampooning the vices, follies, and corruption of 18th century Britain. Hogarth embodies the genre of satire as moralistic reflection. His work focuses on contemporary culture and the values of, quote, polite society, which were adapted from aristocratic models and deployed as ideal representations of identity and community. His early narratives are lessons in moral corruption, providing progressive examples of what not to do if one wishes to avoid spiritual and social decay. His first series, titled The Harlot's Progress, was published shortly after a crackdown on prostitution in Covent Garden, and it satirizes the social revulsion and shame surrounding the common practice of prostitution and the conventional narrative of an innocent country girl corrupted by the big, bad city. In the first plate, Hogarth's fictional heroine, Moll Hackabout, arrives in London, innocent, vulnerable, and beautiful, seeking employment. After being taken in by the real-life figure of Mother Needham, a notorious brothel keeper, Moll becomes a kept mistress. She betrays her rich keeper by having an affair and moves through a series of deteriorating situations, becoming a common prostitute, developing syphilis, and succumbing to Bridewell prison before dying in poverty. In the final plate, her simple coffin is surrounded by an insincere collection of mourners who appear unaware of the lessons to be heeded from Moll's short, tragic life, thus beginning the cycle of corruption and decay all over again. Hogarth repeated this narrative structure in the following year with his second series titled The Rake's Progress, which follows the harlot's male counterpart of a rake, which is a quintessential middle-class man of leisure. A third series, completed about a decade later, titled Marriage à la Mode, satirizes the notion of arranged marriages. In the first plate, the marriage of two unsuspecting children is planned by families eager to increase their social standing and wealth. Doomed by the loveless match, however, the couple moves through infidelity, disease, and finally death and destruction, stripped of all their dignity and promise of redemption. Ralph Steadman turned to Hogarth throughout his career, updating a number of the 18th century masters' prints, and demonstrating how little kind of humanity has progressed through the centuries. Here, Steadman takes a contemporary look at Plate 2 from Marriage à la Mode, which is a breakfast scene in which the newlywed couple slump exhausted and bored in their Palladian salon. Both parties are recovering from separate infidelities and loose behavior from the evening before. The exhibition at the JSMA features two prints published outside of Hogarth's norm of serialization, a rare documentary portrait that integrates hints of satire into a factual historical narrative, and a cultural jab at 18th century aesthetics. The first one, Simon Lord Lovat, demonstrates a delicate blend of artistic restraint and didactic impulse. Simon Fraser, who lived from approximately 1667 to 1747, was a notorious Scottish chief, or Lord Lovat, of the Highland clan Fraser of Lovat. Leaving social and political scandal in his wake, Fraser was outlawed in 1700, restored to his title in 1730, and sentenced to death for treason after a bloody campaign at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Hogarth etched this portrait from life, which he states in the inscription below, as the defendant awaited trial. Hogarth published the final print in conjunction with the verdict, which was put forth in the Act of Parliament on August 25th, 1746. Fraser was beheaded 7 months later on April 9th, 1747 at Tower Hill in London. The seemingly benign documentary portrait sparks with subtle notes of satire and caustic inflections of caricature that impart a didactic moral. The accused chief sits comfortably in his expensive wardrobe and ornate chair, gazing confidently toward the viewer who is positioned in the place of the portraitist. Fraser seems to lack any acknowledgement of his fate or failings. Adding a devious smile, Hogarth distorts his subject's face into a grotesque leer that conveys the internal defects of character that have led Fraser to this moment. A final touch confirms his reputation as a greedy and capricious politician with unsteady allegiances, as Fraser tallies on his fingers any potential supporters who survived Culloden. Five Orders of Periwigs exemplifies Hogarth at the height of his satirical prowess and cultural analysis. The piece is a skilled parody of contemporaneous advertisements, for an impending publication of James Stewart's and Nicholas Ribet's architectural treatise titled The Antiquities of Athens, Measured and Delineated, which was published in 1762. Advertisements for the book occurred throughout the 1760 and 1761. Through this direct reference, Hogarth lampoons the history of architectural treatises and the 18th century's reverence of antiquity. The British class system, contemporary fashion, and the pomp of coronation also receive attention. The print follows the established composition of architectural treatises dating back to the ancient Roman volumes authored by Vitruvius. The page is thus filled with descriptive text, diagrams and sections, perspectival angles, mathematical equations, and anatomical sketches of the wigs. Mocking the ancient affinity for anthropomorphized columns, Hogarth transforms the capitals of the classical orders, which are the Greek Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and the Roman Tuscan and Composite, into periwigs, which were highly stylized decorative wigs popular in Western Europe dating back to the 16th century. These new orders mark various professions and classes of the British society. From the top row of wigs down, the simplified Tuscan capital becomes the episcopal or parsonic wig, reserved for clergy. The more detailed Doric order provides lords and council officials with the old Purian or aldermanic periwig. The loyally Lexonic wig takes over for the Ionic capital, while noble suitors receive Corinthian or Quirinthian wig, and the composite or half-natural order is transformed into a periwig for higher nobility. Along the bottom of the page, here, Hogarth further satirizes the British compulsion to rank social class with a row of coronets, which are small ornamental crowns worn by noble women. The coronets provide female counterparts to the male periwigs and display portraits of Queen Charlotte's entourage at the coronation that the print purports to commemorate. In descending social status, from the far right, the coronets adorn recognizable portraits of the princess, duchess, countess, viscountess, and baroness. As we move through the integration of satire and caricature, we will come to James Gillray, who is celebrated as the prolific and often vitriolic figurehead of Britain's golden age of caricature. His work evolved the experiments of the Italian masters, Da Vinci, Bernini, Gezzi, transforming the art of caricature from benign physical distortions into unmistakable polemic critique. Gilroy's career also traces the popular development and public appetite for the satirical print market, the seeds of which were planted by Hogarth and his contemporaries. A dense network of publishers and print sellers, artists and consumers developed during the 18th century. Prints were sold everywhere from dedicated print shops to warehouses, cafes, and taverns, reaching the broadest potential audience. As depicted in this image, prints would fill the interior of these spaces, covering all available window space, and even often spilling into the streets in haphazard displays. In contrast to Hogarth's self-published and advertised serials, Gilray's work responds to the rapid fire of daily events and was supported by a dedicated publisher who is actually commemorated in this print, Hannah Humphrey, and was sold by subscription, auction, and wholesale purchase. His fearless political caricatures raised the genre to new heights with easily readable visual metaphors that transform real people and events into allegorical representations and symbolic entities. These become digested by the public and become inextricably linked with political and social reality. In this left print here, Gilray depicts Prime Minister William Pitt. However, he doesn't just create Pitt in the likeness of a fungus or a toadstool, as the title suggests. He actually transforms Pitt into this alien creature, and as a physical embodiment of a fungus, which of course carries biting commentary on Pitt's character. Pitt's head grows out of a crown that represents the monarchy, which forms the foundation of the dunghill and sprouts further toadstools. On the second print, titled French Liberty, British Slavery, this satirizes the excess and flawed ideals of the French Revolution, comparing dichotomous conceptual images to critique the relationship between France and Britain. A gaunt France here represents a false notion of liberty, as he ignores his surroundings and declares that he is actually in the speech bubble. He declares he's surrounded by a paradise of, quote, milk and honey. The slothful Brit, on the other hand, with seemingly nothing to complain about, rants about the slavery of taxation. As we can see here, no government entity or figure was safe from Gillray's critical eye. The subtle caricature on view at the JSMA demonstrates Gillray's keen ability to intertwine art historical reference, literary allusion, and contemporary politics. The close grouping and profile perspective of the titular Weird Sisters is borrowed from Swiss Romantic painter Henry Fuseli's representation of the same characters. The title signals William Shakespeare's iconic tragedy, Macbeth, first performed in 1606 as the satirical cover. Recognizable portraits identify the 1788 to 1789 Regency crisis of George III, who ruled from 1760 to 1820 as the prince's subject. Partially shrouded in dark, billowing clouds, these three figures, the titular sisters, stroke bearded chins and pursed lips with anxious fingers as they gaze with impenetrable expressions at an anthropomorphized moon. An inscription at the bottom of the page quotes directly from the characterization offered by Macbeth's faithful companion Banquo when the two soldiers first encounter the drama's prophetic chorus of witches in Act 1, Scene 3. Banquo exclaims, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." The title of the print further alludes to the text, quoting Lady Macbeth's first interaction with the sisters when she calls them to her aid as her, quote, murdering minions in Act 1, Scene 5. In the role of the sisters, Gillray casts three figureheads from the Tory government during George III's reign. Again, we see Prime Minister William Pitt, Secretary of State Lord Henry Dundas, who is Pitt's right hand and closest advisor, and Lord High Chancellor Edward Thurlow, who was a close advisor to the king and an adversary of Pitt. The watched-over moon is carved with faces of the ruling monarchs. The attentive glowing crescent of Queen Charlotte balances the diminished light of her sleeping husband, who is veiled in shadow, potentially alluding to the 6-month period in which the king was declared incapacitated due to a sudden onset of mental illness. Gillray's nuanced interplay with Shakespeare's text intimates at an uneasy analogy, however. If their minions are Macbeth's witches, does that cast the king and queen as the play's doomed couple? And moving on to Spain, we encounter Francisco de Goya, who marks a point of leadership in Spain and a point of connection between the moralistic Hogarth, the polemic Gillray, and the comedic commentary we'll soon see from Daumier in the history of satirical prints. As one of the most important Spanish artists of the 18th and 19th centuries, Goya navigated a tenuous boundary between royal patronage and independent creative expression throughout his career. At the age of 40, coinciding with his appointment as court painter for Charles IV, he self-published one of the most important satirical print series in the history of art, a volume of 80 etchings titled Los Caprichos, which critiques cultural superstitions, religious hypocrisy, and political corruption in 18th century Spain. Goya's self-penned advertisement appeared on the front page of the Diario de Madrid, the first daily newspaper in Spain, on February 6, 1799. In the text, Goya announces, quote, "The artist has selected from among the multitude of follies and errors that are common to all civilized societies, and from the particular prejudices and deceitful practices authorized by custom, ignorance, and utility, those that he believes to be the most appropriate for submitting to ridicule, and which stimulate at the same time the imagination of the artist." He further states, "In none of the compositions that form this collection has the author proposed to ridicule the particular faults of one or another individual. Painting, like poetry, selects from the universal that which it judges most fitting to its ends, unites in a single fantastic person circumstances and characters which nature presents distributed among many, and from this ingeniously arranged combination results a fortunate imitation through which a good craftsman acquires the title of inventor and not that of servile copyist. Two prints from Los Caprichos are on view at the exhibition in the museum and demonstrate Goya's utilization of satire, as he states in his advertisement, as a bridge between the real and the imaginary in order to transcend the limitations of specific reference and craft a narrative of steadfast moral critique. In the print on the left, Goya mocks marriages of convenience, arranged wedlock based in the desire for money and status. Goya depicts his archetypal couple lashed together with a rope to a small tree trunk, struggling to break the literal ties that bind them. Petrified by distress, the woman is a passive entity, no more than an extension of the tree's architecture. Though her arms and hands are free, begging the question, why can't she untie herself, they only serve to provide footing for a bespeckled owl-like creature. The imaginary bird appears in various guises throughout Los Caprichos to signify the flight of reason and the chasm between observation and true understanding. In contrast to his mate, the man exerts a violent effort to free himself, pressing a harsh fist against the woman's hip for leverage. His face shifts in a series of grotesque distortions to express both the external physical struggle and the internal fallibility at the center of his dilemma. Subtle didactic moralizing also appears throughout the volume in thematic undertones of Enlightenment philosophy. These are particularly evident in recurring motifs of education and child rearing, which warn against the use of fear and superstition as didactic tools. Instead of establishing constructive habits and behaviors, Goya argues that such practices reduce the capacity for reason and instill patterns of intimidation that transform free-thinking individuals into passive, servile citizens. In Que Viene el Coco, here, addresses this issue through the cultural fiction of El Coco, the bogeyman, an imaginary figure invented to control children through fear. Goya fills the scene with ambiguity, depicting a woman gathering two frightened children at the feet of the cloaked figure assumed to be the titular phantom. Wrapped with awe, even gratitude and affection, the woman's face presents a stark contrast to the young girl and boy, who shrink away from the hooded figure and try to escape their caretaker's clutches. Fear distorts the boy's features into a grotesque mask of aggression, while the girl freezes in a pose of wide-eyed peril, both rendered incapable of independent thought and action. Similar to his updating of Hogarth, Stedman also frequently turned to Goya for inspiration. Here he riffs off the infamous frontispiece to Los Caprichos, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, and which illustrates kind of the unreined proliferation of fantasy when reason and logic become dormant. And as we move on to our final satirist, Honoré Daumier spent his prolific multimedia career balancing between rebellion and the semblance of conformity. He worked closely with the liberal French newspapers Le Charivari and Le Caricature to produce approximately 4,000 lithographs that document the social and political life of 19th century France. Next to Gillray, Daumier epitomizes an apogee in satirical caricature. His career as a journalistic printmaker was shaped by fluctuating decades of strict press censorship against political caricature. During these periods, Daumier worked primarily, but not exclusively, in social satire. With an alternatingly benign and biting acerbic wit, these series capture the activities, attitudes, and customs of France's rising middle class, the emergent bourgeoisie, and the Napoleonic aristocracy in Paris in mid-19th century. Subtle caricatures strike a balance with realistic detail in each print. Daumier alludes to immediately recognized sociable tights through economical motifs like stoop postures, bloated bellies, and comically enlarged facial features. Ego, social class, and gender roles are frequently satirized, often with eccentric displays of fashionable clothing in incongruous environments, such as this print from Le Bannier, and also glaring disparities between the physical stature and wardrobe of men and women. In each series, satire functions as a mirror that exposes the social pretenses, eccentricities, insecurities, and vices to which everybody falls prey. Rather than didactic morality of Hogarth and Goya, however, comedic relief is Daumier's essential note. His viewers saw themselves reflected in his work and were given the space to laugh before returning inevitably to their quotidian quirks. The interludes of satirical series in Daumier's career document the history of free press in France during the tumultuous decades of the July Monarchy, the short-lived Second Republic, and the Second Empire. Between 1835 and 1848, and again from 1852 to 1866, the French government enforced censorship laws on visual media. Quoting verbatim from the original sentence of 1835, the Act of 1852, Article 22, reads, quote, "No drawings, engravings, lithographs, medallions, prints, or emblems of any kind may be published, displayed, or sold without the prior authorization of the Ministry of the Police of Paris or the prefects of the departments," end quote. When artists were found in violation, the images in question were confiscated, often destroyed, and never published. Very few survive. Anyone involved in the act of drawing, printing, or publishing the work was sentenced to prison for 1 month to up to 1 year, with an added penalty of a hefty fine. Censors were free to decide what was considered offensive and transformed the creative endeavor of print journalism into an environment governed by secret police, surveillance, intimidation, repression, and threats. Yet Daumier and his contemporaries continued to create and to document, to critique, and to publish, setting examples for the cartoonists and commentators and storytellers of the 20th century through today. On the screen, we have 3 examples of the allegorical caricature in which Daumier sometimes worked during these periods of repression, a means to continue his commentary on the hypocrisies of power, which he saw as one of the demands of his role as an artist. In this print, Laura du Nord, which the title translates as "The Northern Bear is the most unpleasant species of all bears," and the polar bear with the crown and sword depicts Nicholas I setting up his monarchy during the 1848 revolution as the revolution spread throughout Europe. In the second print, we see Galileo, who is amazed at the new aspect of the Earth's surface, kind of satirizing the conflict between science and religion, rationalism, and an idealized fantasy. In the final lithograph of his career, this one, Daumier places the emaciated corpse of the French monarchy in a simple coffin, framed by a satirical title that exclaims, "Meanwhile, they keep on insisting that she has never been better." We'll take a look at one more print on view at the museum, which is this one here, Bazet-les-Redoux, before wrapping up. Published in the satirical weekly La Caricature, just months before a 15-year edict of press censorship against political caricature, this print depicts one of Daumier's favorite political subjects, King Louis Philippe, who ruled France from 1830 to 1848. The king appeared or was referenced in over 100 lithographs between 1831 and 1835 and was the catalyst for the artist's first encounter with censorship in 1831 with the scathing Gargantua. Bazet-les-Redoux, La farce est jouée, which translates to "bring down the curtain, the farce is over," is significantly more subdued. Daumier cast the king as Pierrot, the melancholy clown of Molière pantomime and Commedia dell'arte from the 17th century. His polemic caricature distills the corrupt monarch into a swollen figure with an immense belly and a pear-shaped head with drooping jowls. This caricature was common throughout all of Daumier's images of the king. The image also offers a satirical pairing of politics and theater, which was a recurring motif in Daumier's work. Its stage alludes to the private curtained box in which the king sat, isolated from his parliament during their assembly. And the parliament is just visible in the theatrical chambers beyond the drawing curtain. With a confident smirk, the royal clown betrays the lie of his somber pantomime mask as he points to a sculpture of blind justice. Daumier's comment appears to be, "Parliament has concluded and the farce of judicial integrity is over." In the Stedham retrospective, we can see contemporary caricature moving through similar explorations of politics and corruption, transforming world leaders into grotesque animalistic criminals and caustic buffoons crowned with devilish mops of blonde hair. I'll leave you with these irreverent commentaries and a quote from Stedman, which sums up the past and present of satirical prints and their critical importance better than I can. So Stedman says, "The cartoon is the oldest form of self-expression known to man. It is a mark, a meaningful mark, made to communicate instantly an idea, a message, or a point of view to the world. It is a kind of shorthand, a commonplace surrealism, which we have learned to read quickly because we have developed a highly personal visual vocabulary to interpret what, after all, can be the fewest of lines and as personal as handwriting. A line can convey humor, anger, sadness, wisdom, perception, sickness, poverty, pride, lust, and greed, even a recognizable individual. Yet next to a so-called work of fine art, the cartoon is still nothing more than a joke, its predetermined role denying its place of similar esteem. But in fact, the cartoon's impulse to express an idea simply is the germinating seed, the life force at the root of all great works of art." Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you
Thanks.
so much for coming down.
Yeah, thank you.